The wind howled like a banshee across the snow-blasted plateau, driving blinding sleet horizontally into the faces of 10,000 men. It was Palm Sunday, 1461, and the air was so thick with falling snow and a blizzard of arrows that the sky itself seemed to have vanished. On the field south of the village of Towton, two armies, the largest ever assembled on English soil, stood poised to annihilate one another. They were not foreign invaders, but cousins, uncles, and neighbors, their banners bearing the same saints, their hearts filled with a unique, familial hatred. At stake was not merely the outcome of a single battle, but the very soul and crown of England. The outcome of this day, fought in a whiteout hell, would decide whether the House of Lancaster, with its mentally fragile king, would continue its reign, or if the dynamic, vengeful House of York would seize the throne. For the men shivering in the cold, it was a simple, brutal choice: victory or a shallow, unmarked grave in the frozen Yorkshire soil. For the kingdom, it was the bloody pivot upon which 30 years of chaos would turn. At the heart of the Yorkist host was a young man of 18, tall, handsome, and burning with a grief that had been forged into a weapon. This was Edward, Earl of March, son of the recently slain Richard, Duke of York. He had inherited his father's claim to the throne and his enemy's deepest hatred. He was no longer just a nobleman seeking power. He was a son avenging a decapitated father whose head, adorned with a paper crown, still decorated the spikes of York city gates. How could this one young man, his army outnumbered and pinned against a river, with the full force of the Lancastrian nobility bearing down on him in a blinding blizzard, possibly hope to win? What strategy, what trick of fate could turn an impending slaughter into the most decisive and bloodiest victory in the nation's history? This was not just a battle for a crown. It was a battle against the elements, against overwhelming odds, and against the collected might of the established royal house. The reveal came with the wind. The Yorkist archers, commanded by the grizzled Lord Fauconberg, fired a single volley with the gale at their backs. The arrows plunged into the Lancastrian ranks. Then they stepped back. The Lancastrians, blinded by the sleet, could not see that their enemies had moved. They unleashed a furious volley of their own, but their arrows, fighting the headwind, fell short, planting themselves harmlessly in the snow. The Yorkists then advanced, plucked the enemy's arrows from the ground, and fired them back. It was a simple, brilliant, and utterly devastating tactic that goaded the Lancastrians into a premature, chaotic charge into a killing field. The Battle of Towton became a rout, a massacre that left an estimated 28,000 dead, their blood melting the snow and turning the river cock red for miles. Edward the boy Earl was now King Edward IV. History is not a gentle stream, but a series of violent, bloody ruptures, moments where the ambition of a few men in a frozen field can redraw the map of a nation and define the fate of a dynasty for a century to come. The Wars of the Roses was not one war, but a tapestry of these brutal moments. To understand this dynastic madness, we must rewind the clock, back to the reign of a king who was more suited to a monastery than a throne. King Henry VI of the House of Lancaster was a pious, gentle man who suffered from debilitating bouts of mental illness, periods where he was so catatonic he could not recognize his own infant son. His weakness created a power vacuum, a hollow crown that ambitious men began to eye with a dangerous hunger. Into this vacuum stepped Richard, Duke of York. He was everything Henry was not: decisive, popular, and a battle-hardened commander from the wars in France. Crucially, he had a legitimate and arguably superior claim to the throne through his descent from Edward III's second and fourth sons. At first, he sought only to be a guiding hand, a protector of the realm during the king's episodes. But the court was a viper's nest, and at its center was a woman who would not yield an inch of her son's inheritance. She was Margaret of Anjou, Henry VI's French queen. Fierce, proud, and utterly ruthless, Margaret saw Richard of York not as a loyal servant of the crown, but as a wolf circling her weak husband and her infant son, Prince Edward. She became the true leader of the Lancastrian faction, a formidable political operator who gathered allies, raised armies, and was determined to crush the Yorkists and secure the throne for her lineage, no matter the cost in blood. The first sparks of open conflict ignited in 1455 on the cobbled streets of St. Albans. It was less a battle and more a violent, targeted brawl. Richard of York and his powerful ally, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, sought to remove their enemies from the king's council. The resulting clash saw key Lancastrian nobles cut down in the street. The Yorkists captured the pliant King Henry, carried him back to London, and in a moment of profound symbolism, placed the crown back on his head. They had not yet claimed the throne, but they had tasted power and shown that they would shed noble blood to keep it. For a few years, a tense, simmering peace held. An event called the Love Day Procession was even staged, where the leaders of both factions walked arm in arm to St. Paul's Cathedral in a public display of reconciliation. But it was a hollow pantomime. Behind the forced smiles and clasped hands, daggers were being sharpened. The blood spilled at St. Albans had created feuds that could only be settled on the battlefield. Margaret of Anjou in particular was simply biding her time, building her strength for a final, decisive reckoning. That reckoning came in 1460. Emboldened by his support, Richard of York finally made his move. He marched into Parliament, placed his hand on the empty throne, and formally declared his claim to the crown. The lords were stunned into silence. They brokered a compromise, the Act of Accord, which named Richard as Henry's heir, disinheriting Margaret's young son. To the Queen, this was not a compromise, it was a declaration of war on her child. She would not accept it. Gathering a formidable army in the north, Queen Margaret met Richard of York near his castle at Sandal. On a cold December day at the Battle of Wakefield, York, inexplicably outnumbered, left the safety of his castle walls and was annihilated. Richard himself was slain in the fighting. But Margaret's vengeance was not satisfied. Richard's head, along with his son Edmund's and his ally the Earl of Salisbury's, was impaled on a spike above Micklegate Bar in York, a paper crown placed mockingly on his severed head. It was an act of profound brutality meant to end the conflict. Instead, it ensured it would become a blood feud. The death of the father only served to unleash the son. Edward, Earl of March, now the new Duke of York, inherited his father's claim and a burning need for revenge. He was a brilliant military commander, and while Margaret's army marched south, pillaging as it went and alienating the citizens of London, Edward secured a vital victory at Mortimer's Cross. It was here that a meteorological phenomenon, a parhelion or sun-dog, appeared in the sky, which Edward used to convince his terrified troops that the Holy Trinity was on their side. This set the stage for the apocalyptic confrontation at Towton. After his victory, Edward was crowned King Edward IV in London. He was the Yorkist son, a charismatic and capable warrior who promised to end the chaos of Henry VI's reign. But his crown was not secure. The Lancastrians still held the north, and the final, brutal contest for the soul of the kingdom had to be fought and won. Towton was that contest, a battle that effectively destroyed the Lancastrian cause for a decade and cemented Edward's grip on the throne. For 9 years, Edward IV ruled a relatively peaceful England. He was a popular king, restoring law and order and stabilizing the kingdom's finances. King Henry VI and Queen Margaret were fugitives, their son in exile. The Wars of the Roses seemed to be over. But Edward made a fatal political error, a mistake born not of strategy, but of passion. He fell in love and married in secret. His bride was not a foreign princess, a match that could have secured a powerful alliance, but a commoner of Lancastrian stock, the beautiful widow Elizabeth Woodville. When the king revealed his secret marriage, he profoundly insulted the man who had put him on the throne, his cousin, Richard Neville, the immensely powerful and wealthy Earl of Warwick. Warwick had been in France, negotiating a royal match for Edward, and the king's secret marriage made him look like a fool. Warwick, who became known as the Kingmaker, was the ultimate political puppet master of the age. His wealth, ambition, and private army had been instrumental in placing Edward on the throne. He had been the power behind the crown, but now the new queen's family, the Woodvilles, were being showered with titles and lands, displacing Warwick from his preeminent position. The Kingmaker, feeling slighted and marginalized, began to believe he had created a monster he could no longer control. His loyalty began to waver. In an act of staggering betrayal, Warwick conspired with the king's own younger brother, the jealous and unstable George, Duke of Clarence. They secretly raised an army, captured King Edward IV, and executed the queen's father and brother. For a brief period, the Kingmaker held the king himself as his prisoner. He had made one king, and now he had unmade him. But he soon found that ruling the country without a king was impossible, and the king he had was unwilling to be his puppet. Forced to release Edward, Warwick played his final, desperate card. He fled to France and forged an alliance with his most hated enemy, the exiled Lancastrian queen, Margaret of Anjou. It was a shocking, unthinkable pact, brokered by the King of France. To seal it, Warwick's daughter Anne Neville was betrothed to Margaret's son, Edward, Prince of Wales. The kingmaker, the ultimate Yorkist, had switched his allegiance to the Red Rose of Lancaster. In 1470, Warwick's invasion force landed in England. King Edward IV, caught off guard and with his support crumbling, was forced to flee to Burgundy with his youngest brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Warwick marched into London, freed the bewildered Henry VI from the Tower, and placed him back on the throne. This redemption of Henry VI was a surreal moment. The poor, mentally fragile king was paraded through the streets, a puppet king for a puppet master earl. But Edward IV was not his father. He was not a man to accept defeat. With funding from his brother-in-law, the Duke of Burgundy, he landed back in England in 1471 with a small but determined force. He outmaneuvered his enemies, gathering support as he marched towards London. The capital, tired of the chaos and financially loyal to Edward, opened its gates to him. He was king once more, and Henry VI was back in the Tower of London. Now Edward had to face his two greatest enemies in the field. First, at the Battle of Barnet, fought in a thick fog, he met the army of Warwick the Kingmaker. The battle was a confused, brutal affair, where visibility was so poor that some Lancastrian troops mistakenly attacked their own side. Warwick, trying to flee the field, was cut down and killed. The Kingmaker was dead, his incredible career of political intrigue over. Just as Warwick was defeated, Queen Margaret and Prince Edward finally landed in England with their own army. Hearing of Warwick's death, they tried to retreat to the safety of Wales. But Edward IV's army, in a feat of incredible speed and endurance, intercepted them at Tewkesbury. The resulting battle was a final, crushing victory for the House of York. The Lancastrian army was shattered. The most significant casualty at Tewkesbury was the young Lancastrian heir, Edward, Prince of Wales, who was killed either in the battle or executed shortly after. His death was the death of the House of Lancaster's future. His mother, Queen Margaret, was captured. On the very night that King Edward IV returned to London in triumph, King Henry VI died in the Tower of London. The official cause was melancholy, but few doubted that he had been murdered to extinguish the Lancastrian cause forever. With all his enemies dead, captured, or in exile, King Edward IV ruled for 12 more years in relative peace and prosperity. He was a capable and effective monarch when he applied himself. The Wars of the Roses were, for all intents and purposes, over. The House of York had won completely and utterly. But the seeds of its own destruction were already being sown, not by external enemies, but from within its own family. In April 1483, Edward IV, still in his prime at just 40 years old, died suddenly of an illness. His death plunged the kingdom back into uncertainty. His heir, Edward V, was a boy of 12. The late kings will named his most loyal brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector of the realm until the young king came of age. Richard had been Edward's steadfast right hand, a capable administrator and soldier who had remained loyal even when their brother Clarence had betrayed them. Richard of Gloucester rode to London, professing absolute loyalty to his young nephew. He intercepted the boy king's party, which was dominated by his Woodville relatives, and arrested the Queen's brother and son. He brought the young Edward V to London and housed him in the Tower of London, which was then a royal residence, not just a prison, in preparation for his coronation. Soon after, he had the king's younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, join him in the Tower. Then something sinister began to unfold. The coronation of Edward V was postponed. A priest came forward and declared that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid, as he had a prior contract to marry another woman. This stunning declaration meant that all of their children, including the two young princes in the Tower, were illegitimate. The next in line with a legitimate claim to the throne was the Lord Protector himself. Parliament, under pressure and desiring a strong adult king over another contentious minority rule, passed an act called the Titulus Regius, a officially declaring Richard of Gloucester the rightful king. He was crowned King Richard III. The two young princes who had been seen playing in the Tower Gardens were seen less and less until they were not seen at all. They vanished from the pages of history, creating one of the most enduring and chilling mysteries in the English canon. The disappearance of the princes in the Tower was a propaganda disaster for Richard III. Whether he murdered his nephews or not, the belief that he did spread like wildfire, shattering his support among the Yorkist nobility. Betrayal and rebellion sprung up almost immediately. The Wars of the Roses, which had seemed over, were about to enter their final, bloody chapter, sparked not by a rival house, but by the implosion of the victorious House of York. Across the Channel in Brittany lived the last, most obscure Lancastrian claimant. His name was Henry Tudor. His claim to the throne was incredibly tenuous, derived through a legitimized but barred line from John of Gaunt. But in the chaos of Richard III's reign, with the legitimate Yorkist heirs gone, a weak claim was better than no claim at all. Disaffected Yorkists, disgusted by Richard's usurpation and the presumed murder of the princes, began to flock to Henry Tudor's banner. He was their last hope. In August 1485, Henry Tudor landed in Wales with a small, motley army of exiles and French mercenaries. He marched inland, gathering support as he went. King Richard III, a proven and courageous warrior, assembled his royal army to meet this final challenger. The two forces met near a small market town in Leicestershire, at a place called Bosworth Field. The battle was a treacherous, uncertain affair. Richard III possessed the larger army, but loyalty was thin on the ground. Several powerful nobles, most notably Lord Stanley and his brother, stood aside with their private armies, waiting to see which way the wind would blow before committing. In a desperate final charge, Richard III spotted Henry Tudor's banner across the field and gambled everything on a single cavalry assault to kill his rival. Richard fought with the ferocious courage for which he was known, cutting down Henry's standard-bearer and getting within a sword's length of Tudor himself. But at that critical moment, the Stanleys finally made their move. They threw their forces into the fray against King Richard. The king's charge was overwhelmed. Surrounded and refusing to flee, Richard III was cut down, the last English king to die in battle. The crown, which had fallen from his head, was supposedly found in a thorn bush and placed on Henry Tudor's head on the battlefield. The victory at Bosworth Field ended the Wars of the Roses. Henry Tudor became King Henry VII, the first of the Tudor monarchs. In a brilliant political move, he married Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's eldest daughter, thus uniting the rival houses of Lancaster and York and creating the new Tudor Rose. The long, bloody, and chaotic struggle for the crown was finally over, not with the victory of one house over the other, but with their symbolic and literal fusion. Decades of civil war, initiated by a weak king and ambitious cousins, were concluded by a chance discovery in a thorn bush, reminding us that the course of nations can be altered forever by the fall of a single king on a muddy field.